This is our final session of the meeting, so I just want to thank everyone so far, and we have a phenomenal last session. We've heard a lot about the technology that's been here and what's coming, and now we want to look forward, see what's on the horizon, and see what challenges are for us as we go forward, see what lessons we can take from now and apply them as we all move forward as patients, physicians, and caregivers. This panel is going to be organized a little bit differently. We're going to have each of our speakers have about a 15-minute talk, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. So I'll first invite Dr. Mildred Cho up to the podium, professor in the Division of Medical Genetics and Department of Pediatrics at Stanford University, and associate director of the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics, and director of the Center for Integration on Research and Genetics and Ethics.
Thanks, Ruth. Thank you for inviting me to hold hands with giants. I'm honored. And also to let me hold hands with baby Theodore this morning. That was the thrill of my morning. So I am going to be talking about one of the challenges on the horizon that we have sort of touched on. Karen mentioned this, Jamie mentioned this, Annie mentioned this, several people have talked about one of the expansions or evolutions of prenatal testing since the conference 20 years ago is that it's now become a commercial venture. And one of the questions that's been raised is, how does this change who has control over it? And just to be provocative for discussion later, I'm going to say that clinicians don't have control over it. Individual people who are going to be getting prenatal testing using non-invasive prenatal diagnosis or testing don't have control over it. It's the companies that will have control over it. And depending on the way it plays out, it might be one company that has control over this. So we've been doing some studies to examine the business landscape of non-invasive prenatal diagnosis. And it's a pretty crowded space. There are many companies that have been mentioned, but there are also other companies that have intellectual property or patent applications on this, and they're listed on here. So I'm just going to talk about the main players right now, who are companies that actually have products that are either commercially available now or will be very soon. One of them you've heard a lot about, Sequenome, which in October started offering their Maternity 21 test, and in February offered what they call the Maternity 21 Plus test, which then includes trisomy 13 and 18 in the test. And it uses massively parallel sequencing for that. Veronata, formerly known as Artemis, so you may not recognize Veronata, but that's the name of the company before was Artemis. In March started offering their test, which is called Verify, in small letters, I'm not really sure why, which is also for 3 trisomies. There's 2 other companies. One of them is called Natera. It used to be called Gene Security Networks. It used to offer testing. The technology they developed was different. It was not using the same technology as the other 2 companies, and they had been doing it for IVF because their technology allows them to analyze single cells. So they were doing it on single cells taken from a blastocyst. But they've now adapted that technology to look at fetal DNA in maternal serum. And it also is a SNP-based approach at this point, not a sequencing-based approach. And they use what's called parental support, which looks at the DNA of the mother and the father and compares that informatically to make inferences about fetal DNA. And in February, they announced their trisomy 21 test, and also it includes trisomy 13 and 18, which they announced at the Society for Maternal and Fetal Medicine meeting in February. That test is not commercially available yet, but they are doing clinical studies. The last one I'll talk about is called Ariosa. It used to be called Aria, and before that it was called Tandem Diagnostics. I don't know why, but they use a tandem SNP-based approach, and in March announced their Harmony prenatal test at the American College of Medical Genetics meeting. So There are other companies that may enter this space. They're not as far along yet, but I just show this slide to indicate how these other companies are actually using slightly different technologies. So some of them are using immune precipitation of methylated DNA, quantitative real-time PCR, multiplex ligation dependent probe amplification, sequencing of DNA from urine, which I'm told is the euphemism for that is transrenal DNA analysis, but it's not serum. Or some of these companies are really using this for other applications than prenatal testing, so paternity testing or sometimes cancer testing. But these companies are not yet offering commercial products. So at this point, there's only 2 companies who are at least officially offering commercial products. This company has done what it calls a soft launch, which means that if you call them up at the number on their website, there's a number that it says 4 clinicians call this number. You can call that number and they will let you order a test. And so there are people who are getting testing from them. All of these 4 major players have started their technologies or developed the initial technologies with public funding. So whether it's, or from foundations, so NIH through SBIRs or research grants, the NSF, the Medical College of Wisconsin, where that initial technology for the tandem SNP approach was started, also supplied funding for the research. The government of Hong Kong supplied money for some of the stuff that was patented by, and licensed by Sequenome. So there are a lot of patents on all these tests. Sequenome has, all of these companies have at least one, but in all these cases more than one patent that are related to the this particular prenatal application of their different technologies that they're using. Sequenome has a major patent, which is by the patent lawyers, it's called the 540 patent for non-invasive prenatal diagnosis. The patent holder is Dennis Lowe. ISIS Innovation, which is the assignee of the patent, is actually the Oxford University Technology Transfer Licensing Office. So this was for work that was done at Oxford University by Dennis Lowe. Life Codex is a company that has an exclusive license to practice prenatal testing using this patented technology, but only in Europe. Veronata has licenses from Steve Quake at Stanford University for a couple of patents. Natera has a license for non-invasive prenatal ploidy calling that was obtained from research that was funded by an NIH SBIR grant when it was called Gene Security Networks. And Ariosa also has a patent which was issued to a faculty member at the University of Louisville and also at Wisconsin with the research funding from the Medical College of Wisconsin. So you probably can't read all this, but I'll read you some of this. So in last July, the gauntlet was thrown down. So Sequenome officials said that a patent the company holds for prenatal diagnosis via maternal blood will prevent competitors from launching similar tests unless they license the technology or come to some other agreement with the company. And then Marcy Graham, Sequenome's Senior Director of Investor Relations, told Clinical Sequencing News that if another company wanted to offer trisomy 21 laboratory-developed test, they would need to come through us, meaning Sequenome, to license the technology. Furthermore, Oppenheimer analyst David Ferrero wrote in a recent research note based on a visit with the company that management believes the in-licensed 540 patent, the one held by Sequenome, which extends into 2018, will block all non-invasive cell-free DNA-based approaches. So that's pretty clear. Not much ambiguity there. And in interviews that we have done with the officers of all these companies, one of the folks called this 540 patent the mother of all patents. And I'm not going to go through a whole patent analysis, But just here's the language. It's a method for detecting a paternally inherited nucleic acid of fetal origin performed on a maternal serum or plasma sample from a pregnant female, which method comprises amplifying a paternally inherited nucleic acid from the serum or plasma sample and detecting the presence of a paternally inherited nucleic acid of fetal origin in the sample. So it's a very broad patent. There are other claims in there which are more narrow, but they're actually still quite broad too, and cover many different ways of analyzing the maternal serum. So I'm not going to go through what the other claims are, but I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what's happened since last summer when that news article came out, which I think will have important implications for the reality of how the NIPD testing is going to play out. So in December last year, ARIA, now called Ariosa, received a letter from Sequenome requesting a detailed explanation for why they were not infringing on the 540 patent. About 2 weeks later, ARIA shot back and filed a complaint in U.S. District Court, which asked for a declaration that ARIA's test does not infringe on the 540 patent, and then went further, claiming that Sequenome actually misrepresented its scope with the goal of deterring potential competitors from entering the market and deterring doctors and healthcare providers from using any other test than Sequenome's. Now, that is sort of what patent law actually lets you do, but that's a whole different conversation. I mean, where patent law is concerned, there's also a public policy element to public law that courts can actually speak on. But then Natera piled on there and asked for a declaration that Natera's paternity test does not infringe on the 540 patent, and also then claimed that some of the claims that Sequenome had in its in the ISIS patent were invalid. And then, not to be left out, in February, Veronata and Stanford University, Stanford is actually the patent holder, Steve Quake, and Stanford's the assignee, joined in district court and asked for a declaration that their test does not infringe on the 540 patent, and then went again further, saying that Sequenome infringes on their patents. So it's just a free-for-all at this point. It's all being dealt with in this district court. It hasn't really gotten that far yet, so I don't think there's anything that we know yet about how they'll settle this. But suffice it to say that however this comes out will have a major impact on who gets to offer the test, and then whoever gets to offer this test will get to then determine how it's offered, what it's offered for, how much it costs, and all those things we've been talking about. So providers may have nothing to say about this. And so I'm just going to finish by saying that one of the things that this raises is that we've sort of heard this before, right? We've heard this with Miami Children's Hospital and the Canavans disease test. We've heard this before with Myriad and the BRCA test, which is at the Supreme Court, which may also have an impact somewhat on the way that these patents are or are not, valid or upheld or so forth. And one of the things that I think is similar with this, there are similarities and differences between the way this may play out and the policy implications and some of the other genetic diagnostic tests, because those patents were on specific genes. These patents are on methods of analyzing genes, which is a bit different. But I think one of the things that came out from looking at patents on specific genes is that patents on genes may be different from other kinds of patents in that, I'm just showing this to you to illustrate what that difference might be. For other kinds of biomedical applications, the patents come out on, let's say, a drug, and then maybe 10 or 15 years later, there'll be clinical trials and maybe an FDA approval, and then there might be a product that comes out at the end of that. And the argument about patents is that they are necessary to invest money and get money from investors to drive that innovation. This is a graph that shows gene patents and laboratory tests for hemochromatosis. So the red line indicates the number of labs that were providing tests for hemochromatosis relative to when the patent applications for the HFE gene were first filed in 1995. A paper was published in 1996 showing that association. The labs around the country immediately started offering these laboratory-developed tests. The patents didn't actually issue till 3 years later in 1998, at which point 2/3 of the labs that were going to be offering the test were already offering the test. So it's a very different relationship between patents and a product in the realm of genetic testing than in, say, pharmaceutical development. And part of that is because the the way FDA regulates pharmaceuticals versus the way they do not regulate genetic tests. So there's all these requirements. You have to get a lot of funding to go through the clinical trials and so forth. So one of the things that's a bit different about the way NIPD is playing out is that they have been, Sequenome, for example, has gotten a letter from the FDA saying, you know, what's going on here? And all these companies are doing large-scale clinical trials at this point, but they have not been required to get those clinical trials approved by the FDA in a pre-marketing approval. Nevertheless, they have had to raise millions of dollars of funding to do the clinical trials that are in progress right now. So it may be that the way whether the FDA chooses to follow up on its letter to Sequenome and require clinical trials or not will also have a major impact on how the testing rolls out and the extent to which they are validated or not. But anyway, I'll just finish by saying that I think even though I think that this commercial environment will have a major impact, I think that actually makes it more important that clinicians, such as the groups like the International Society of Prenatal Diagnosis and ACOG and other groups, I think it makes it more important that the clinical groups, professional groups, step into this void of how practice actually becomes implemented. Okay.
I'd like to invite Nancy Press, Dr. Nancy Press, up to the podium. Professor, School of Nursing in the Department of Public Health and Preventive Medicine, School of Medicine at the Oregon Health and Science University, and School of Nursing in Portland. Nancy, can you?
Yeah.
Which one are you?
Final, one down. Final CWRU down.
Oh, I see, right here?
Yeah, should be it.
Wonderful. Okay. There you go.
Thank you.
And there's your pointer if you need it.
Good morning. Very early morning for me still from Oregon. But so the other thing I want to say first is, in addition to thanking everybody, even though I've spent my whole career in medical schools and schools of nursing, I actually was trained as an anthropologist. And in anthropology, if you give a talk, you write a paper, okay? And you then read it word for word. And people throw things at you in medical schools if you try to do that. So I am now living in a PowerPoint-based universe, but I haven't quite gotten it down yet. So, because when you write a talk, you can then read it and compulsively time it, you know, until you know exactly how many. So I'm hoping this may either be too short, which probably isn't a problem, and too long, in which case I'll just be quiet. But so the charge of our panel was to look a little bit into the future. So it's somewhat different, and I have been doing some work with epigenetics and have gotten really fascinated with epigenetics and want to talk a little bit about what it is and implications for two things. One is not specifically prenatal testing, but I think that some of the main interesting things about epigenetics that are being picked up first have a lot to do with maternal health and policy around maternal health. And then secondly, I want to talk about the implications of epigenetics for women's reproduction and prenatal medicine in one application where I don't think there's much that is new ethically or socially, even though the technology is new and exciting, and one place where I think that that epigenetics may provide a way into some policy revision. So epigenetics is definitely the new thing. Since I had actually never heard of epigenetics when somebody asked me if I wanted to do a CERA application about it, I will assume that there's some of that here too. So what's really interesting about epigenetics is that it kind of bridges, was one of the things that bridges the gap that I think a lot of social scientists who are sort of non-reductionist by and large by training always had an inkling of when listening to the dialogue about DNA and the book of life. And once we've sequenced the genome, we're going to understand everything. And I think to a lot of people, there was a sense that biology's got to be messier than that. And in fact, Maynard Olson, who is a big-time geneticist, published a thing where in some paper where he talked about the fact that the first 10 or 15 years of genome science was a kind of protected, sort of, he didn't use this word, but a protected paradise for reductionists, because you could actually make a great deal of progress in a very reductionist model. But that now that that was done, and things like epigenetics and all sorts of investigations of gene expression are what are being looked at, genetics is back into the incredibly messy and complex realities of biology. And of course, as a social scientist, I love that. So. And epigenetics is one of those things. So epigenetics are several kinds of marks, biochemical marks above, which is the epi part, the DNA, that change the expression of the DNA without changing the DNA sequence. And the two that are most studied right now, but there are constantly new things being discovered, are methylation, the addition or subtraction of a methyl group to the DNA, and histone modification, which actually has more to do with how the DNA actually folds. And what all of this really does is affects what areas of the DNA are available to be transcribed into protein. And two things that epigenetics helps explain that are otherwise quite mysterious and have been mysterious for a long time is the move from pluripotent cells in early embryonic development to liver cells that know how to be a liver cell and heart cells that know how to be a heart cell. And that's actually a problem that, as basic as it is, has been sort of a mystery. And so epigenetics is just sort of hit popular consciousness a few years ago and is being incredibly investigated. In terms of cancer, where in fact tumors are very deranged in terms of their methylation. So there's a great deal that has to do with epigenetics in cancer, but also all behavioral phenotypes and all kinds of things. So the NIH definition, and I think I have this from the NIH website, is that epigenetics is the study of heritable changes in gene expression caused by mechanisms other than changes in the underlying DNA sequence. And the most interesting thing about that definition is the use of the word heritable, because you can actually get people who do epigenetics in a room together, bench scientists, and they won't agree on what heritable means in that definition. There are two possible meanings, and NIH was not apparently being dumb. They were fudging. They didn't want to have to come down one place or another. What everybody agrees is that what is definitional about epigenetics is what some people call mitotic stability, which means that when the cell has an epigenetic change and it divides, there is inheritance of all those epigenetic changes from one cell to another. And that's why the liver cells continue to be liver cells as they reproduce. The other meaning of heritable, which is the sort of common sense one, is that it means that it can be changes in the epigenome can be inherited from one generation to another. And there's a lot of data accumulating that that's the case, but it's not exactly clear how it's the case, because one of the things that happens during fertilization is the epigenome of the parents get wiped out and then reset up in a couple of waves during fetal development. So how it could be that it in fact gets inherited is not very clear, but especially with some animal models, it is, and to some extent with humans, epidemiologically, there is a great feeling that there is that kind of inheritance. So what interested me is that epigenetics looks like it might constitute a paradigm shift in the way genetics works. And specifically, although there's been a long discussion, especially in behavioral phenotype work, of gene by environment interactions, there's something that's been, to me, essentially static about that. It's kind of been an additive model. How much is the environment, how much is the gene? And epigenetics is kind of the moving part. It literally suggests that nurture of various kinds can change nature and change it in real time. Some of those changes are reversible sort of automatically. For example, when someone is stressed, there appear to be epigenetic changes that when the stress passes, the epigenome goes back to normal. Not normal, it's pre-perturbed state. And there may also be plasticity, but it also means some people have interpreted this as almost a Lamarckian kind of view that environmental pressures that affect a person, let's say a woman, change her epigenome in a way that is not changing the DNA, but if it's inherited, things that have stressed her, affected her, changed her may be inherited by her children. So there is a possibility, especially in a lot of environmental work, that epigenetics will really provide a new way of looking at things. On the other hand, there is a real thrust in science to make things manageable in the way that scientists manage them, which is through a reductionist lens, and it's possible that that might be what happens. So just two covers of magazines to show that tension. There was a big article, I think this was maybe 3 years ago, in Time magazine, and you can read the heading, Why DNA Isn't Your Destiny, and it was a typical sort of Time magazine, very breathy, breathless. Oh my goodness, this is the new thing. We were all wrong. It's not, DNA isn't your destiny. You're not doomed. There are all these other things that happen, and this is so exciting, and so it was the cover story, okay? About a year later, this came out. Okay, and there were things in between, but I thought that these two showed it very clearly. And even in a way, I was almost cheating, because if you look at the subheading there's already a hint, of that sort of unidirectional, what you're doing may affect your kids, which I'll talk about more later. But there's definitely, to me, a sort of opening up of a paradigm here and a shutting down again. But what is particularly interesting to me is the way that pregnant women have been put absolutely in the center of this conversation about epigenetics, especially in the popular press. And these are just some of them. And two of the most striking areas, because there's some data to support them, have to do with that top one, mellow or stressed mom's care can affect the DNA of her offspring. I don't have time to talk about it, but it's a really interesting study with mice models done at Duke by, I think it was Randy Girdle. And anyway, don't want to lead you astray, but it was definitely done at Duke, and it showed that the way mother rats care for their pups, in terms of the way they lick them and groom them, actually changes their epigenome and can lead to lifelong anxiety disorders, as that is measured in mice in cages. And the other one has a lot to do with diet, and I'll talk about the diet once. So it seems to me there's sort of, the epigenetics is unfortunately at this point leading to a trope that's kind of all moms all the time. And one of the most interesting ways that it's doing this is through something called the fetal origins hypothesis, sometimes called the developmental origins of health and disease hypothesis, sometimes just called the Barker hypothesis over the eponymous David Barker. And This work started with an epidemiologic observation of two populations that went through a famine. One was the Dutch hunger winter, which was during World War II, when all food for a while was blockaded out of the Netherlands. The other was during a similar period of time in northern England. And the epidemiology is really interesting. What was found when David Barker looked back at this many years later, that women who were pregnant during this period of food restriction gave birth to low birth weight babies. Those babies then came into a world where there was abundance of food, and they went through a period of rapid compensatory weight gain. What is now known is that probably, and Barker did know, is that probably during what happens during that period of pregnancy, when there's insufficient food, is that there are biological choices made by, sort of by the fetal mechanism. So the things that are absolutely necessary for development, like brain development, happen, but other organs are kind of cheated. So there's this compensatory weight gain, and the connection is between low birth weight babies and those babies, when they grow up, having things that we have thought of as problems of affluence, heart disease, and diabetes, sometimes referred to as the metabolic syndrome. However, I was recently at an international congress on developmental origins of health and disease. The conversation, I will just say, is all now about mothers eating too much, and overweight mothers, and poor women who eat badly. And these are the things that at just this 1-2-day conference I saw tied to women's dietary choices in terms of their babies. This was a 3-day conference. There was, I think, one talk on the possibility that common pollutants, that combinations of common pollutants in the environment are actually leading to some of the increases in diseases that have very rapid increase, and we don't really know why. Everything from autism to diabetes. But the main attention is if we could only get these women to eat right. And I was at one sub-conference that was specifically concentrated on policy, and someone I would take to be a well-meaning person trying to defend against this onslaught of why don't these women just do the right thing, said, I don't think we're being fair. I think a lot of women really care if their babies are healthy. Okay, so let me just say there very quickly. I think that there are two ways that this fetal origins of disease hypothesis could go. One is the direction it seems to be heading in, which is more responsibility on mothers that they haven't done the right thing, they need to do the right thing, that it may not just be your children, but it may also be your grandchildren if the epigenome is inherited. And the whole sort of gender discourse and blame discourse. I also think it's possible to use some of this data as a wedge in a discussion about things like WIC and maternal care and reproductive health, and say, here is some real data that if women in pregnancy aren't supported well, there are implications for their children and possibly for further generations. So, just moving really quickly. In terms of epigenetics and prenatal testing, there are uses of epigenetics right now that have to do with non-invasive testing and detecting rare imprinting disorders. And I don't think that they probably raise any issues that are different. The technology is different, but I don't think the issues are different. Where something is interesting that's happening is in assisted reproductive technologies. Because there's accumulating evidence that ARTs may have negative effect on the fetuses, and through epigenetic mechanisms. So even though there has not been any data that there are DNA-based ill effects from ARTs, there is accumulating data that, and I am almost through, there is accumulating data that, that epigenetic mechanisms which have not been looked at before may be a link between ARTs and fetal harm. The strongest direct evidence where people actually could, in a lab, look at the epigenome have to do with rare imprinting disorders, and this makes sense because imprinting is one process that we know allows the epigenome to be inherited intergenerationally. But those are, of course, rare disorders, and this is all correlational studies at well, all right, they were all correlational studies for a while. Even now, when they see changes in the epigenome, there are some people argue, well, you don't really know if those epigenetic changes caused the infertility, or if that led to needing ART, or if the ARTs caused the problem. But I think the weight of evidence at this point is the problems of ARTs. The other thing that's known is that data are accumulating quickly that children born through various kinds of assisted reproductive technologies, even singletons, even once you take the twinning thing out of the equation, are more likely to be born with low birth weight. And this has been found in rodent models in laboratories. It's also been found in agriculture. With cloned animals that are being cloned so that there are more cows to eat. So if, in fact, assisted reproductive technologies tend to lead to lower birth weight babies, it then links into all of the prior discussion about the possible risks to future adult health of low birth weight babies. And there is some research in humans showing an increase in systolic blood pressure among children conceived through ARTs. Now, obviously, if what you're talking about is something negative that happens to a fetus, has an effect when that child reaches 30 or 40, the data aren't there yet on any large-scale basis. But it does, to me, suggest that that this may again be a wedge issue in terms of trying to revisit the lack of regulations of assisted reproductive technologies. And Andrew Feinberg, who's a very well-funded NIH researcher through NHGRI and has the only, I think, NHGRI-funded epigenome sequencing center, looked at all of this evidence and one of the things that he also stressed was the fact that some harm may come not just from the techniques, but from the culturing media that the in vitro fertilization goes on in. And he had some reason for data that he presented on why there may be epigenetic effects from things in this culturing media, and noted that companies don't have to reveal the formulation of this. And he said it's remarkable that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration regulates tissue culture media for human ex vivo use only for toxicity and sterility, and does not consider the effect of varying media on pregnancy outcome or birth defects. So I think that on a policy level, sort of stay tuned to epigenetics in the way it's used both for things that we might want to support as a group and things that we might be concerned about in terms of the implications for mothers. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. That's one of the disadvantages of being the moderator. I don't want to stop the conversation, but I'd like to invite Professor Max Mehlman down to the podium. He is the Arthur E. Persledge Professor of Law and the Director of the Law Medicine Center here at the Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and Professor of Bioethics at the Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. This panel is dealing with challenges on the horizon, and my horizon is arguably the farthest out in the future. This talk is based in part on a book that is coming out this summer from Johns Hopkins. My title was Extinction by Design. Their marketing people insisted that the word dystopia appear in the title, so they came up with this. As reproductive technologies advance, there's increasing interest in their potential effects on human evolution. The transhumanists, this is, by the way, the officially sanctioned transhumanist PowerPoint slide, are positively giddy about the prospects. Gregory Stock says humanity is leaving its childhood and moving into its adolescence as its powers infuse into realms hitherto beyond our reach. The idea of adolescence controlling human evolution is kind of interesting. Others are not so enthusiastic, and the science fiction literature, for example, is full of dystopic images produced by human genetic engineering. Nancy Kress's Beggars in Spain, in which the children are engineered not to need sleep. Lois McMaster Bujold's Free Falling, in which quaddies with 4 arms are enslaved to do extraterrestrial mining. Gattaca, of course, and Margaret Atwood's Children of Crake are all very disturbing images of the future of genetic engineering. The genetic engineering in both the transhumanist paradise and the fictional dystopias goes far beyond prenatal testing, which is the immediate issue that we're discussing. But suppose that genetic testing at the pre-implantation and prenatal stage really became routine. And if that were to happen, from an evolutionary standpoint, are there any potential threats to the future of human evolution? Well, to answer this question, we need to have a pretty good understanding of human evolution, how it works, the basic forces. Unfortunately, we don't have a very good understanding. We think of human evolution as progressive. This is the classic from the Time Life books, but this is really incorrect. There's no progress in natural evolution, explains biologist Ernst Mayr, because there is no known genetic mechanism that could produce it. Now, biologists agree that evolution itself is a fact, but beyond that, we enter a realm of tremendous uncertainty and disagreement about many key aspects of human evolution. When did humans migrate out of Africa? We don't know. There's no agreement. Did we descend from a common male or female ancestor? We disagree. Why are we bipedal? And for those of us who suffer from back pain, are we indeed bipedal? Why did human brains increase in size? What truly distinguishes us from other animals? Why are there no other living human species? And every time somebody comes up with a promising answer or theory, Artie, the oldest human ancestor unveiled, it doesn't take long for somebody else to shoot it down, Artie, the human ancestor who wasn't. And then come the molecular biologists who think that the fossil record itself is completely misleading. Well, needless to say, all of this uncertainty among the scientists gives the creationists a field day. But knowing as little as we do about natural evolution makes it hard to determine what difference new reproductive technologies would make in our human future. Now, this pulls in two opposite directions. On the one hand, it makes it hard to argue against reproductive technologies that impact human evolution on the ground that God's plan or natural evolution is clearly going to do a better job. On the other hand, we need to be very cautious, I think, when we alter processes that we understand so poorly. Well, from an evolutionary standpoint, and again, looking far down the road, what could go wrong? Well, if everyone opted for similar offspring with similar characteristics, there is, of course, the threat that we could reduce genetic diversity to the point where we were less able to withstand sudden, dramatic insults from the environment. Now, it's unlikely if parents were only using pre-implantation and prenatal genetic testing that this would happen, because they're only working with the combinations of their existing genes rather than using things like cloning or active genetic engineering. But some believe that cloning and active genetic engineering in humans is not as far off as we might think. After all, we've come quite far in animals. And we've even made considerable progress in primates, which is, of course, the sort of big crossover. These are the marmoset babies with the jellyfish genes that glow in the dark. These are the babies. Their mothers also glow in the dark, and their babies presumably will too. Another concern from an evolutionary standpoint would be a loss of reproductive success. For example, if humans dramatically reduced their rate of reproduction. How could this happen? Well, it could result from genetic testing if genetic testing became widespread enough, and if most parents chose, for example, to have children of one gender. Now, again, this is unlikely to be that widespread, that is gender selection. At present, the country with the greatest gender disparity, anybody want to guess? China? India? No, it's the United Arab Emirates, which has a ratio of 2 men for every woman. It's not because of gender selection, though, it's because of foreign guest workers, male foreign guest workers. But prenatal selection for desirable characteristics, coupled with growing social inequality, might lead to a situation in which the genetically well-off increasingly differentiated their offspring genetically from those who were less well-off and had less access to these genetic technologies, and also led their children to refuse to mate with those who were less genetically well endowed. Over time, this could lead to a genetic and phenotypic divergence sufficient to actually produce separate human subspecies. Now, in the past, this hasn't boded well for at least some of these subspecies. Scientists, some say that cannibals ate Neanderthals out of existence. We might even see Homo sapiens itself become extinct. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. After all, evolution is all about species coming and going. Like that just came and went. Kim, what happened? Oh, no. Ah, thank you. I can't see it here, so I guess you can. So evolution is all about species coming and going, but the problem is that with modern weapons, we might do more than just replace one species by another. We might end up extinguishing the human race, or in biological terms, our lineage, that is, our accumulated genetic load and our cultural achievements. Now, an interesting question is, do we have the legal tools to prevent this from happening? Well, there's good news and there's bad news. Arguably, we do have a legal regime. We have one now, the public health system. And this is Justice Harlan's description of the basic premise of a legal premise behind the public health system from 1905. According to settled principles, the police power of a state must be held to embrace at least such reasonable regulations established as will protect the public health and public safety. Now, surely protecting the human lineage would count as protecting the public health and safety. So we could imagine in the future establishing a unit within the Public Health Service that would be monitoring these activities and that would identify and assess the risks from reproductive technologies, identify those that threaten the lineage, and then intervene to prevent this. Well, but there's bad news too, because as we know, the public health system has not always acted reasonably. And so, for example, we're all familiar with the syphilis experiments at Tuskegee and at Guatemala, and the Buck family and the eugenics movement. And these are not just sort of overreachings in the past. This is the Model Public Health Act that Larry Gostin conceived after 9/11 to respond to the threat of bioterrorism, and it was so broadly crafted in its original version that it would have authorized state governors on their own initiative to mandate women to have prenatal genetic testing. My favorite, however, is this incident. This is our old friend, the notorious Phoenix Sheriff Arpaio, who locked a non-compliant TB patient in solitary confinement for 9 months, where he was watched by video cameras 24 hours a day. The light in his cell was never turned off. He wasn't allowed to go outside, look out of a window, exercise, have access to the TV or the internet, receive visitors, or for 9 months take a shower. If we create a capability within the Public Health Service to monitor and guard against engineered threats to the human lineage, we also must make sure that these public health authorities act reasonably. There's another, perhaps more immediate threat. If the changes produced by reproductive technology were sufficiently abrupt and extreme, the one in the upper right is real, the others are fictional, it might provoke a political backlash against the emerging technologies. We already see the growth of an anti-science movement in this country. Confronted by the rapid growth of genetic technologies and options for genetic decision-making, there might be an attempt not only to ban these reproductive technologies, but to halt scientific progress more generally. So researchers trying to develop and improve reproductive technologies must be careful, for example, not to provoke such a backlash. For example, they must be careful to observe the ethical and legal rules that have been established to govern human experimentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'd like to invite Dr. Lisa Parker, Associate Professor of Human Genetics, the Graduate School of Public Health at University of Pittsburgh. Okay.
But don't close that because it takes time.
Okay. Can you still see where you want to see?
Yeah.
Okay, there. Okay, let me just take the background back to neutral.
Oh, good. You can give us space, too.
There you go.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you for gathering all of us for this conversation. It's been fascinating. It's also been a bit difficult to figure out what I will add to it at this later stage of discussion. I had planned to reflect on the way in which women are in a kind of damned if they do, damned if they don't take advantage of or utilize prenatal testing technologies. And I think, however, others, particularly Karen and Rachel today, covered very well the gap between the expansion of these technologies and options and the contraction of women's actual access to technologies necessary for their health and making good use of, full use of testing technologies, as well as a continued instability of social services to support their caring for children with genetic anomalies. So I think that's been covered. It's, I think, also unclear how those of us in genetics, in obstetrics, in bioethics, prenatal testing communities, and so on, can really address these contradictions. So I'll talk about two mixed messages, to use Karen's term, that seem to be fed to some degree by those very communities, or at least by geneticists, bioethicists, research ethics, and regulatory communities, because maybe we could do something about these. And I think they do have an effect and can be translated back into a prenatal context, particularly if we look ahead to the whole genome sequencing that's on the horizon, I think, prenatally. And so I want to talk about, I guess, first, a mixed message. I think most everyone agrees that medical professionals, ideally in discussion with their patients, would determine what genetic information or what tests would be offered to those patients, what genetic information would be made available to them, reported back to them. There seems to be a general tenor of sort of bemoaning the direct-to-consumer genetic testing movement. I was at ACMG and part of a panel that was talking, on the one hand, with great excitement about what we're learning about the physiology of sports, about what makes for a great sprinter and a great power lifter and whatever, but at the same time, real concern about Atlas and Cygene and Sports Factor X that are offering to people, parents often, testing particularly, say, for the ACTN3 gene, so that parents can usefully track their children into sprinting and other power sports, or away from that into a team sport or whatever. And so on the one hand, I think there's recognition that that train has left the station, the horses have the barn. We have regret about the fact that all of this testing is available, and maybe some concern about direct-to-consumer, unregulated, or really just unthoughtful use, eventually, of whole genome sequencing. Yet, in the research context, not direct-to-consumer, but NIH-sanctioned or otherwise well-funded genome-wide association studies, genomic research with biorepositories, and so forth, there's a sense that there is this, what's I think mischaracterized as, an emerging consensus that, based on people's preferences to have information, that we should return information to people, at least offer it to them, granted with their consent, but admittedly without any semblance of what would actually be informed consent about whether they could learn in these contexts about their increased risk for a particular condition. They won't be able to give informed consent because they won't know whether they want the information until they already have the information. Then what do we do? And we're seeing this supposedly supposed consensus has emerged even as there's increasing concern about the actual predictive capacity of personal genome sequencing. So that we had a paper that came out last month that had the one sort of concluding line of, thus our results suggest that genetic testing, at its best, will not be the dominant determinant of patient care and will not be a substitute for preventive medicine strategies incorporating routine checkups and risk management based on the history, physical status, and lifestyle of the patient. So we're gaining some modesty based on the science about what whole genome sequencing is really going to be able to tell us that will be useful for health planning, life planning, health behaviors, and so forth. But there does seem to be, not just in the consumer environment, about these nifty, sports-related or maybe quasi-recreational genetic information, as well as some health information, but within the genetics community and the bioethics community, interest in sharing information that we can. There's also, I think, a failure to call for comparative effectiveness studies of genetic testing generally. I mean, that quotation from the paper by Roberts, Vogelstein et al. Suggests that we should perhaps engage in a wider discussion of and get some good data about the actual effectiveness of beginning our preventive strategies with genomic testing, or incorporating genomic testing more generally into healthcare at all life stages. And we can think about that from prenatal through older age. But there isn't really a call for studying that effectiveness, and that might be, just throw it out, because of the eugenic overtones of considering cost, genetic conditions plus testing plus cost, that are valid, real concerns, but that we may see the influence here of both a eugenic past and a reproductive medical context that may kind of infect or infiltrate all of genetic genomic medicine, where we're not inclined to look at costs, at least not yet. And then as sort of a final point of not exactly contradiction, but maybe apparent mixed messages in the rhetoric because we don't get down to the subtleties. Georgia Weissner yesterday made the very important point that genetics is statistical. Tests are reported back statistically. It's not a yes-no prediction. And I think sometimes we think of this, or at least the public does, because we say genetics, genomics are in their infancy. And we'll just get better at it so that then it will come down to, and we'll have a precise answer. We'll get at least really, really close to yes, no. And I think we're missing the point that genetics is epidemiologically based. It's in your genome, yes, but the significance of that, the maybe $1 million interpretation of the $1,000 gene chip, is still going to be based on studies that show the significance in populations of those genomic findings. So that the promise of personalized medicine, whether it's, from prenatal care through older age, is not all that personal. Personalized, getting closer, maybe, but actually irreducibly based on population understanding and or on population factors, and on environmental factors, whether those are intracellular or across society. And I want to throw that into our discussion as we think about bringing whole genome sequencing into the prenatal context. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Dr. Rocio Moran, Medical Director of the General Genetics Clinic and clinical geneticist at the Genomic Medicine Institute at the Cleveland Clinic. Do you have some slides?
Yeah.
Okay.
One of those two. I don't know which one will work, so I brought both.
Okay. There you go.
Great.
So again, like everybody else, it's humbling to be here, and it's humbling to be able to share my experiences as a clinical geneticist at a large medical institution. I want to bring you my perspective and kind of bring about the conversations back down to the clinic, which is currently occurring now, and the reality that we face with these emerging technologies on a day-to-day basis. I want to digress a bit before going into kind of some of my case presentations and talk about an experience I had yesterday. I had every intention to coming here on time and getting a chance to meet everyone before my talk today, and I got a call from my nanny at 10 o'clock that my son had fallen and bit through his bottom lip. So as a good parent, I rushed him to the ER, and I was calm. I'm a pediatrician by training, and it was going to be okay. But what I wasn't prepared for is the changes that have occurred in the 12 years since I graduated medical school and did my training. And when I came to the emergency room, I try not to indicate that I'm a doctor, because part of me wants to see how things will play out and knowing that I can pull that card if I need to. But as soon as I hit the emergency room and physicians started coming and talking to me, I was given options. I was told that I could do nothing about my son's significant laceration. We could glue it, which really had just been emerging as I was a resident, so I didn't know a lot about that, or they could suture it. And I don't remember giving patients options in the emergency room. They came to the emergency room because you needed to do something. And it struck me as I was waiting, and because there were so many choices, because then the choices became, okay, I wanted it fixed. And then the choices became, well, do you want to papoose him and, struggle to fix a lower lip laceration that, if he wanted to be a clarinetist, might have an impact on his ability to be a skilled clarinetist? I don't know. Or do I give him intranasal Versed? I never used intranasal Versed. Or do I give him ketamine? So there were so many choices that I was being asked to give. And as a parent who doesn't have medical training, oh my gosh. So translate that in the prenatal setting, where you're giving all these options to patients, some with or without genetic counseling, and what are they faced with? They come to you, this is my first pregnancy, or I'm pregnant with my third, and it's a happy time, and then you give them all these options. And how, as a patient, do you navigate that? And how do you navigate that as a physician well, so that you're providing cutting-edge technology to your patient, but you're doing it in a responsible way? And so that's kind of the background I want to give you, and I don't think you can give a medical talk without talking about financial disclosures. That's been beaten into my head in terms of those. I have no financial disclosures. I can't decide if that's a good thing as a junior faculty. Should I want them? Does that mean anything? I don't know, but I don't have any financial disclosures. And to provide a little bit about my background so you know where I'm coming from, I am a clinical geneticist. I spend 80% of my time seeing patients. I have a primary training in pediatrics and was lucky enough to train with Anne and Georgia over at Case after medical school, and I was lucky enough to be able to supervise a group of physicians and genetic counselors over at the Cleveland Clinic, and I've been there for about 6 years. I'm a huge promoter for genetic counselors and genetic counseling services. I think that genetic counselors are underutilized and under-recognized important members of the medical team, so I spend a lot of my time in talks promoting their services. And I wanted to provide case presentations for discussion and for thought of when things go well applying current technology and when things don't go well. Unfortunately, spending more time on when things don't go well. But I think in reflecting on when these tests are offered, if they're offered correctly with pre-test counseling, I think these can be powerful, effective tools in the clinical setting. It's when they're done incorrectly with incomplete information that disasters tend to happen. So in trying to provide a scope for myself and given this talk, I always like to say, okay, where have we been and where are we going? And I don't think that any of this kind of timeline I put together, really focusing on the prenatal options, is that different from the prenatal setting, the postnatal setting. What's striking to me is how quickly these things occur and how quickly postnatal options are translated into the prenatal setting. The prenatal ultrasound really revolutionized a lot for us, but it's really not that different now. We're finding, and it's not that different from genetic screening and genetic testing. Despite our best efforts of prenatal testing, we still, like Donna indicated, have patients with multiple congenital anomalies that we don't know the genetics of and can provide really no insight other than to the presence or absence of problems that could be more or less severe once a baby is delivered. You know, the promise of the chromosome karyotype that really has now been usurped, if you will, by the prenatal chromosome microarray for good or bad. I mean, I can't tell you the last time I ordered a straightforward chromosome analysis on a baby that's been born. You know, obviously there's more caution in the prenatal setting, but the reality is these are quickly being adopted into clinical practice, and for right or wrong, genetic counseling and pre-test counseling doesn't necessarily occur at the rate that it should. And now, since Lowe's paper in 2007, this whole concept of non-invasive prenatal diagnosis and where that's leading us, and the direct-to-consumer marketing that's occurring, that's really prompting patients to, or and pregnant women, and to say, well, this is the right test. I want to do what's right by my child, and they really hone in on that vulnerability. And then on the physician side, you know, these companies are going to the physician saying, look what you can offer your patients, and, you know, really capitalizing on the vulnerability of the physician, who really, in my feelings, really want to do right by their patients and provide them with the cutting-edge technology, but perhaps not having incomplete information to be able to share with their patients. And thinking about the limitations of this type of screening, you know, nothing is new in the prenatal setting, and certainly it's the same in the postnatal setting. But in the prenatal setting, we are faced with a time-sensitive clinical situation. We can't stop time. Pregnancies will continue, and there will either be a demise or a continuation of a pregnancy. You know, all of us in medical genetics cringe at the, you know, undetermined clinical significance results, and obviously in the postnatal setting, that doesn't have as significant an impact as you do on the prenatal setting. Obviously, incidental findings and non-paternity, it happens all the time. And then the idea of false positives and false negatives in the setting of tests that are being marketed that have poor clinical utility and validity. And the variability of the pre-test genetic counseling that occurs. And I can't emphasize enough just the importance of applying all this technology in a responsible way. And, you know, I wish this was a room of OBGYNs, because I'm preaching to the choir here, you know, but just trying to get that understanding, and the limitations that are, you know, being faced by our providers are real. I'm not naive to say that, you know, every provider who's offering this type of testing has the time allotted per patient. You know, at the Cleveland Clinic, we are being asked to do more with less, and that includes our time. So how do you do this, and how do you do it effectively? And as another disclaimer, I don't have the answers. You know, I raise these questions because I think they need to be considered. But it's a difficult field to navigate. I don't like to be rude or disrespectful to my colleagues that are not in genetics, but there is limited genetic knowledge. You know, I spent 5 years in a fellowship doing this, and how do I expect someone who didn't do training to be able to understand all this? And that's the reality that we're facing, and referrals aren't being made until sometimes it's too late. And then there's limited providers available for consultation. I'd like to think that I have 10 genetic counselors to dispatch to my prenatal OBGYNs, that they're available to do all this. And the reality is that I don't. I have, you know, 2 prenatal counselors to address 11,000 births that occur within the Cleveland Clinic system. So the providers are, you know, the expertise is also limited. And then I had to add this in because it really struck a chord with me, this whole thing about directive and non-directive counseling. And I know some people try to say that's a dying term, but I think in the prenatal setting it's not a dying term. I think it's an important term to consider in the prenatal setting, because for me to be able to counsel effectively, I have to be able to provide facts to my patient. I cannot bring in my own personal experience because I'm meeting this person for the first time, maybe 15 minutes into a visit. How can I assume to know their spiritual background, their family support network, their upbringing, their experiences? And my personal experiences should not factor into theirs because they're so significantly different. My job is to educate a patient so that they can make an informed decision about what's right for them. And my opinion has no place for that in that setting. And again, this is speaking from my opinion. And a perfect example of that is I went to a family, and I'm applying whole exome sequencing for the first time in a patient who's in the ICU right now. And I spent an hour going through the informed consent process with this family who I thought would sign on the dotted line, but I knew I had gotten it right. Because the question is, how do you know if you've provided effective informed consent? How do you truly know? And I knew I had gotten it right because at the end of the visit, the patient said, we want to wait and think about this. So to be able to provide them with the pros and cons and give them the data. And so when someone asks me, what would you do in this clinical session, or the clinical setting, the best advice I got from a genetic counselor at Cedars-Sinai was to give them the questions that they should ask themselves. So to turn it back on the patient and say, I can't tell you what I would do, but I can tell you the things that I would think about. What would the impact of this, positive test mean to me? What would I do with that information? What would it do for my feelings about this pregnancy, for my family, anxiety? And to give them the types of questions that they need to ask themselves in order to make an informed decision. So in terms of cases, I have two to present. The first one is the lack of applying available technology to aid in families in the prenatal setting. And the first is a 37-year-old woman who was referred to us with infertility. She had undergone multiple cycles of IVF and was determined to have poor egg quality. Donor oocytes were recommended, and donor sperm was also requested by the family. And as far as the family knew, the donors had been screened, and to this day, we still don't know what that screening process was. The egg donor, we later found out, was a 35-year-old woman, and the sperm donor was a healthy 25-year-old man. Pregnancy was achieved on the first round, and she was pregnant with twins. So from an REI's perspective, this was a successful case. She elected to do first trimester screening because of well, I'm not sure why that was offered, but she elected to have first trimester screening, and it was abnormal that revealed an increased nuchal translucency in twin A. A CVS was recommended and performed at 12 weeks, which showed a twin A of a 45X karyotype and twin B with a derivative translocation. So the reproductive endocrinologist went back to the donor sperm and found out that he was indeed a carrier of a balanced translocation. And the question was that, genetic counseling had never been recommended until results of the CVS had been complete. And that raised a lot of red flags for us and questions about the process that we have. Well, this wasn't our center, but the process that was in place for reproductive technology techniques. So the second case is another unfortunate case, and of a case of technology gone wrong. This is a 32-year-old surrogate who was referred for evaluation of an abnormal twin pregnancy at 12 weeks gestation. The egg donor was a 37-year-old friend of the biological father who was 40 years old. Pre-implantation genetic diagnosis was completed on a single-cell microarray performed on both embryos through their local REI center. And twin A was a normal female, and twin B was a normal male. Growth delay of twin A was noted at 12 weeks, but because of the normal array, invasive testing was declined, and a repeat ultrasound at 16 weeks revealed basically multiple congenital anomalies. At this point, we got a call that said, what do we have to offer this patient? And we screamed amnio. And sure enough, this was consistent with a trisomy 18. Interestingly enough, the biological father who had hired the surrogate is an attorney. So, this will continue to go on. So I bring these cases up not to be a Debbie Downer, because again, these are great, this technology when used correctly is so powerful for our patients, but what are the processes that we have in place to assure that we're doing the right thing by our patients by offering this? And with this rapidly emerging technology, how do we keep the pace up so that we can continue to offer this technology to our patients? Should genetic counseling be standardized? Should that be something that we offer all our prenatal patients, regardless of age or indication, who is undergoing prenatal testing and pre-implantation diagnosis? Should counseling be a process put in place for screening egg donors, sperm donors? What exactly should be standardized or not standardized? And who's qualified to provide the genetic counseling? Is it a physician that should be doing it? Is it a nurse that's been trained? Is it a genetic counselor, recognizing the limitations that we have? And the providers that we have. So I want to end with this because I think it's a great statement. I would love to take credit for finding it and applying it to genetics, but I think it's very great. This was Donald Rumsfeld in 2002, who was quoting the lack thereof of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And I think it really captures what's going on in genetics today. And I think what's frightening are the unknowns, but I think that's also, drives everybody in this room to learn more, to write more, and to really get those issues out there for consideration so that we can continue to provide excellent care to our patients. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite each of our panelists up to the front, and if there are any questions from the audience.
Rocio, how's your son? Oh, he's good. We ended up with ketamine, and he has 10 stitches.
So he may play the clarinet someday. Okay.
It does make a difference for playing an instrument, I can tell you that. That's what I've heard. Not that I play an instrument, but that's what I've heard.
Not surprisingly, I want to talk about non-directiveness. I think it's important to continue this conversation because the way you very nicely outlined how we help people learn information and clarify their values and make it a personal decision-making is absolutely the tenet of genetic counseling, whether you're a physician or a genetic counselor. The problem is that non-directiveness has led a lot of professionals to get very uninvolved with their clients, especially around very difficult decisions around continuing or not continuing a pregnancy. And when we say that we keep ourselves out of it or it's all about the client, we lose our own internal resources to be able to actually help somebody. And it doesn't mean that we impose our values around what we think the outcome of that pregnancy needs to be. It's about the fact that I value so highly exploring and understanding that woman and that couple's choices. That is my value, and it exudes from me. And so it is value laden, and it is directive. I shape a conversation. I probe them for understanding. I probe clarification of their values. That is very directive. So I think we have to be really careful. We are not directing people towards an explicit outcome, but we are directive in our relationships with people. Carl Rogers wrote about this in the 50s after he introduced the term in psychotherapy. He wrote, "I've realized there's no way ever to be non-directive in an interaction with a client, and yet we continue to use that term." So I think what you mean, none of us disagree with, is I don't go in and think I know better than the person in front of me what the outcome of their choice ought to be. But that's different than not being directive in our care.
If I can just comment, I get your point. I just think that in the non-genetic counseling geneticist world, there is so much direction that's given, and I don't know that a fair and balanced perspective is given, so that I think it does resonate in a way with the non-genetics community, and continues to do so. And I think we are agreeing on the same principles, but perhaps just semantics is.
But I would call it personal autonomous decision-making. That's what there's a problem with that.
Let me introduce another ethical conundrum relative to disclosure. I am Dor Dearborn, and I am the principal investigator of the Case Western Reserve National Children's Study. As
Our
some of you
sympathies.
are probably well aware, there is a rather major discussion going on at NIH and at all the centers relative to disclosure. Now, let me remind you that we have the capability in some of the formative research approaches in the National Children's Study is to do prenatal whole DNA sequencing. And also that we're talking about an eventual 100,000 children followed from preconception until they are 21 years old. And that the purpose of the study is to try to gather data on the interface of environment, broadly defined, genetics, and it's a longitudinal observational study. And I think you can immediately see the ethical conundrum disclosure. And I hope people in this room are part of that conversation, because it's not simple. It's not straightforward. Where do we draw the line? Ethically, morally. So, I welcome you joining that.
I might just add the relevant as the children's study. There was some interesting data. I don't know if it was coming out of Washington D.C. or New York, that when they asked people about joining the study, they were able to set limitations on what they were willing to give, and that they could say no genetic testing. And there was a large proportion of the population that said that. So I don't know what relevance that information has in the discussion.
Could you explain for the non-physicians in the group what you mean by non-disclosure?
Meaning that if we, well, for instance, in a formative research project of looking at applying total genome sequencing, the second trio coming out of the University of Washington had a cystic fibrosis heterozygote. Do you disclose that to the family, or you do not disclose that to the family? What sort of genetic information do you disclose at what point in time? Remember, we're following these children till they're adults. At 18, do we then tell them that they've got a disorder? When do we tell them? What do we tell them? And who do we tell them? And frankly, it's a current issue. We've already consented people.
Yeah. What did they consent to?
Taking the genetics aspect out, we have the population in this county where we've consented people that we were going to do genetic testing. And we're already providing cord blood into repositories, or we don't know exactly what's going to be done.
Under the understanding that they probably would not hear anything back.
Yeah.
Generally, right. And the first set of consents that we got, that we had to use that were put together by NIH, did not meet the GWAS standards. And so we locally had to put an addendum in to meet those as far as we were concerned. But still, as Patty will tell you, the consent process is not really complete.
So are you allowed to recontact? I mean, I know our IRB would not allow us to recontact patients without either an amendment or a reconsent.
I'm not certain.
Are you allowed to, you're asking about whether or not you should be contacting this family that a carrier was identified as a carrier for CF. Are you allowed to, because if it's an observational study, are you allowed?
That's the whole controversy right now, is to whether we're allowed to release, to disclose. Obviously, we're going to be in contact with that family for the next 21 years.
What is the informed consent?
It's rather vague. It's rather vague.
Well, there are other, I mean, there are several groups that have made recommendations about disclosing or not disclosing, or how to disclose and how to decide how to disclose. And, you know, the Framingham group and NHLBI and other groups have published those. So unfortunately, they don't really all agree, especially implications, whether those should be considered, you know, criteria for disclosing or not disclosing, you know, reproductive importance. But one thing that that is more clear is that if you are collecting samples for a research project and you're not doing those through a CLIA certified lab under by clinical standards that meet sort of standards for storage of the sample and labeling and that sort of thing, then that really argues against disclosing results, because the samples could have been mixed up, or, you know, the freezers could have been not sort of clinical grade storage and that sort of thing. So,
Although I think you can still say something like, you might want to go to your doctor.
absolutely,
And, you know.
right, especially for something like cystic fibrosis, where there are labs that do that kind of testing and have, you know, validation, and there's some understanding of what the variants mean. But the groups that have made recommendations have sort of parsed out different kinds of reporting standards based on sort of what people know about the clinical and analytic validity and severity and actionability and those sorts of things. So there's some guidelines out there.
We have time for just one more question. I'll move you around.
I'll be kind of quick. I'm going to move back into the future with the epigenetics stuff that Nancy's been talking about. And I think it's really fascinating that they're really focusing on mothers' behaviors right now, especially since some of the earliest research on epigenetics was on environmental toxins like BPA and the effects that those have clearly had on epigenetics. And it seems kind of parallel to what's happened in cancer debates like breast cancer, where they're insisting on focusing on screening and detection rather than on any kind of the environmental arguments. But it may be that we need to go back and consult with the lawyers that were up here a few minutes ago, but do we see any legal implications of this sort of blame the mom rhetoric that's becoming quite dominant? Is there a possibility that this could be sort of a parallel to wrongful birth kinds of things, or is this completely beyond the pale?
I certainly haven't heard any of that yet. It's mainly moral opprobrium rather than anything legal. Whether or not epigenetics will change legal precedent because of its potential heritability, which is a whole other kind of issue. One of the things with DES, and there are now DES granddaughters who are trying to sue for damages, and so far that hasn't had any legs, and it may never, because there's the legal opinions seem to be based on, you know, I think Mark Rothstein said, you know, enough is enough. I mean, nobody's going to develop anything if you can go back 3 generations later and hit a company. But the effects of BPA and DES and all sorts of estrogenic agents may be changing the epigenome, and that may lead to some energy behind environmental law. But, I have not heard anything, which doesn't mean that it's not possible, as another way to hold the mother responsible for the health of the child legally.
Well, that's only one perspective, because of course you could have the state attempting to control the behavior of the mother, and you could have
True.
the health insurance system attempting to, we have the broccoli debate, let's just make it pregnant women and what they eat. We've had some precedent for that.
Interestingly, broccoli sprouts are a very powerful epigenetic methylation agent. So,
it's both the court law, but there also could be some of the state in the context of that.
And with all due respect to our colleagues from the Cleveland Clinic, could Toby Cosgrove refuse to hire a pregnant woman who was obese?
With that comment.
Thank you. Would her pregnancy make a difference? Because they don't, isn't there, they have a practice not to hire obese people.
That's my question.
Would pregnancy make a difference?
So thank you very much. On your schedule, it says that we're going to take a break and then do a wrap-up, but we thought we would just go straight to the wrap-up, finish everything up. Pardon? Oh, I thought you finish everything up and then just close the symposium, so we'll go straight ahead with that. Was it just yesterday I presented this slide? Yes. It feels like a long time ago, because we've made so much progress. There have been so many wonderful discussions. In trying to answer these questions that I posed to the group, we set the conference up, the symposium up, to walk through each of these topics, framing the question, bringing the question of genetic testing back to the woman. And thank you for Dr. Ralston for those fabulous pictures of showing it's not just about the uterus with the cut off head and the legs, it's about the woman as well. Then we want to talk about the current clinical challenges, what's going on right now. And then looking ahead with the march of science, seeing how things are changing and getting a sense now that we know what the challenges are in the present, what will they be in the future? And then looking at the clinical realities as well, so post-testing, what's going on? If we have so much advanced with genetic tests, but then ultimately it comes down to the choices that happen after that test becomes available and what options are there in pregnancy. And then looking forward as these technologies continue to advance. So thank you so much for all of your wonderful input on each of those. So we've had the chance to look at the ethical, the legal, the social, and I want to add a C on the clinical as well, because I think you've got to look at all four together when you think about what these technologies do. And I want to thank all of our speakers for their excellent presentations, for their expertise in this area, but for their candor and their bravery and their boldness to talk about these issues. Some can be very controversial, and I really thank them for talking about them today. So this was the title of our symposium, and the focus is on the word prenatal. But something I've noticed, it's far more complex. If I can use a laser pointer here. So we started out at prenatal, and listening to everyone talk over the past couple days, I find out it's not just about here, it's about preconception, it's about preimplantation genetic diagnosis, and it's about newborn screening as well. But newborn screening circles back down to here as well. So it's not just about the prenatal. In addition, it's the post-pregnancy, so issues about reproduction, future reproduction, but also, thank you, Dr. Mahowald, reminding me it's not just about pregnancy, it's about women's health outside of reproduction. We've been talking about women and reproduction, but we have to think of all the other important aspects of a woman's life outside of this as well, and what the information gathered here can speak to the rest of her life here. So it's important as we go forward, seeing how complex the picture is, that we keep our eyes on the implications, the ethical, the legal, the social, and the clinical. And understanding that, much like human DNA, each of these disciplines are closely intertwined. We need to separate them to understand the issue at hand, but also we need to bring them back together to understand the real elegance and beauty of what we're doing here with genetic technology and medicine. So thus we need to work together as a group, the different disciplines coming together to answer the questions I posed at the opening of the session, but also to keep asking the questions. Ask the questions that need to be posed as the technology moves forward so we can take care of patients, which is really the goal of this technology. So let's keep moving the field forward. I think that we've asked some questions, we've answered some questions, and I think I'd like to keep that dialogue going because it's been a productive talk. There's been such outstanding multidisciplinary work in this area, both clinical and academic, and I want to see that continue. Collaborations, I hope that they continue, both new and those are existing. And keep the discussions going on after the symposium closes today. Other ways to try and spread the message. One is we're going to have a special edition of the Health Matrix, which will talk about many of the discussions here, so we'll have many of the presenters writing a piece for that. But also, Jessica and I spoke last night about the idea of an edited volume. What is the best way to teach people about these issues? I think as Dr. Moran said, you know, we're preaching to the choir here that we need to have other fields involved. And so we know that cases are the best way to teach sometimes. So what we're considering doing is doing an edited volume, bringing together each of the cases we've talked about, developing a chapter for each one, and exploring these issues through it. And this would be the kind of resource that we'd need to give to students and professionals in the area of bioethics, law, genetics, medicine, OBGYN. So if this is something that you're interested in being part of, please let me know, because I think this will be another very important way to keep our dialogues moving forward from today. So 2012 forward. So what will we see? How will things change? Looking forward, there's so many new technologies and changes on the horizon. And so we will need this community here today that's come together to continue that dialogue. Let's just not wait 20 years to do it again. Thank you so much, everyone.